Clara Bennett was 28 and running out of places to belong. 3 weeks after losing her apartment and the small Montana library position she had believed would become her lifelong career, she accepted the only offer she had left, the weathered cedar cabin her late godmother had arranged for her to occupy whenever life left her nowhere else to turn. The decision felt less like an inheritance than borrowing time before winter arrived. Even so, Clara packed her aging station wagon herself, folded the old wool blanket Evelyn Harper had given her 12 years earlier across the passenger seat, and chose the Lakeside road instead of searching for another temporary rental she could never afford. The cabin stood alone beneath towering cedar trees on the eastern shore of Flathead Lake, separated from the nearest occupied house by nearly a mile of shoreline and a gravel lane lined with abandoned fence posts. It had not been empty for long, yet it already carried the quiet stillness of a place waiting for someone specific. Evelyn had spent decades preserving local history, and Clara suddenly wondered whether the cabin itself had become one more archive nobody realized was still keeping records. That thought refused to leave her as she unlocked the heavy front door. The familiar scent of cedar, stone, and old books greeted her before silence settled over every room. Resting her hand on the broad Fieldstone hearth, she remembered Evelyn's habit of saying that every lasting home protected more than walls. Clara had always believed those words were about kindness. Standing there alone, she was no longer certain. If Evelyn had hidden something inside this cabin, Clara sensed it would not simply explain the older woman's past. Somehow, impossibly, it would explain her own. She wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders, crossed the dim room toward the hearth once more, and noticed a single narrow line of pale mortar cutting through the darker stones, as though one carefully chosen block had been replaced years after all the others. The first thing Clara unpacked was the old wool blanket. She spread it across the narrow bed beneath the cabin's loft window before opening a single cardboard box, a habit she had never questioned until the familiar scent of cedar soap drifted from its woven fibers. Evelyn had washed the blanket every autumn, insisting that clean wool carried warmth longer into winter. As Clara smoothed a wrinkle near one corner, her fingers brushed the tiny stitched symbol she had noticed only hours earlier. She almost traced it again, then stopped herself. There were leaking gutters to inspect before nightfall, and practical work had always been the safest way to quiet questions that hurt too much to answer. She collected a ladder from the woodshed and climbed carefully along the cabin's front eaves. Years spent preserving fragile maps, repairing torn archival bindings, and stabilizing century-old county ledgers had trained her hands to move slowly, to recognize the difference between ordinary age and meaningful damage. She had never considered those skills remarkable. They were simply the reason people trusted her with things too delicate for hurried hands. Losing the library had not taken that ability away. It had only taken away the place where it belonged. The scrape of loose cedar shingles beneath her boots pulled another memory into the present. At 16, after Clara's mother died, she had spent one October weekend helping Evelyn replace storm-damaged roof boards on this very cabin. She remembered complaining that every weathered plank looked exactly alike until Evelyn placed two boards side by side and showed her the tiny differences in grain, telling her that careful people learned to notice what everyone else walked past. The lesson had stayed long after the weekend faded. Clara tightened the final gutter bracket and climbed back to the ground carrying a rusted coffee tin she had found lodged behind the downspout. Inside were only old masonry nails and a folded receipt from a local stone supplier dated almost 18 years earlier. She assumed the paper recorded an ordinary chimney repair after a harsh winter and slipped it into her pocket without another thought. Before carrying tools back inside, she wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders against the cooling evening air and stood, facing the broad hearth once more. From outside, the chimney looked perfectly centered above the roofline. Inside, however, the pale strip of mortar seemed to angle ever so slightly toward the lake, as though whoever rebuilt that section had measured something other than balance. The folded receipt remained in Clara's jacket pocket as she drove into the small lakeside town the following morning. She needed to visit the attorney who had handled Evelyn Harper's estate, partly to collect the remaining cabin documents and partly to understand why a woman known for careful planning had arranged occupancy instead of simply leaving the property outright. The answer mattered more than ownership. If the cabin truly belonged to someone else after her stay, she needed to know before spending money she did not have on repairs. The law office occupied a modest brick building facing the county courthouse. Inside, Attorney Daniel Mercer placed a slim folder on the conference table before sliding a ring of brass keys toward her. The paperwork confirmed exactly what Clara had already suspected. Evelyn's will granted Clara immediate and exclusive residential access to the cabin, authority to maintain it, and permission to preserve everything inside. The deed itself, however, remained in trust until several documented conditions had been satisfied. Mercer explained that Evelyn had written unusually specific instructions. No structural demolition was permitted. Any major repair had to preserve original materials whenever reasonably possible. Every journal, map, photograph, and handwritten record found inside the cabin was to remain together until cataloged. Clara signed the occupancy agreement without hesitation. It was not permanent ownership, but it was enough. For the first time in weeks, she could choose something instead of simply accepting whatever remained after life closed another door. Before she left, Mercer opened one final envelope addressed in Evelyn's handwriting. Inside rested a handwritten note only 2 sentences long. Take care of the house before you ask it questions. Some answers disappear when people hurry. Clara folded the note carefully into the same pocket as the old stone supplier's receipt. Outside, she stopped at the general store for chimney mortar, roof sealant, canned food, and fuel oil, calculating every dollar against the small unemployment check that had barely covered gasoline. The cashier, an older woman named Ruth Kellerman, noticed the cabin keys resting beside Clara's wallet. "You're staying at Evelyn's place?" she asked quietly. Clara nodded. Ruth hesitated before placing the receipt into the grocery bag. "Just remember," she said, "not every old repair was meant to be improved." The warning sounded practical, the kind experienced homeowners offered newcomers every autumn. Yet something in her expression suggested another meaning Clara could not quite read. Back at the cabin, she carried each supply inside before returning to the station wagon one last time. The old wool blanket still lay folded across the passenger seat. Instead of leaving it there, she wrapped it over one arm and unlocked the heavy front door again. If this place expected patience, she would begin by earning the right to understand it. She stepped across the threshold carrying the blanket, the keys, the legal papers, and Evelyn's note together, then rested her fingertips against the broad Fieldstone hearth as though accepting responsibility for something far older than the cabin itself. Clara spent her first full day inside the cabin proving that roofs, chimneys, and water lines cared nothing about grief. Every practical problem demanded attention before memory could. The kitchen hand pump coughed rusty water before finally drawing a clear stream from the well. One window beside the lake refused to latch against the wind. The chimney draft pulled smoke back into the room whenever the damper opened more than halfway. None of those failures surprised her. Buildings that stood through decades always asked to be understood before they agreed to shelter anyone. She began where she trusted herself most. Instead of replacing damaged materials outright, she documented everything with careful notes, measured each stone around the hearth, photographed every crack, and sketched the mortar joints into a notebook exactly as she wants. Recorded fragile courthouse maps. Preservation came before repair. Evelyn had repeated that lesson often enough that Clara could almost hear her voice correcting careless hands. By afternoon, the broad Fieldstone hearth revealed its first inconsistency. Most mortar joints measured nearly identical widths, yet one narrow vertical section near the eastern side varied by almost half an inch. That alone could have been the result of an old repair, but the aggregate mixed into the lighter mortar contained crushed river shell unlike the darker original lime mixture surrounding it. Clara marked the difference without drawing conclusions. Older cabins accumulated repairs the way people accumulated scars. One unusual section proved nothing. She lit a small fire before dusk to test the draft again. As the flames strengthened, heat spread evenly across the stone except for the pale section, which warmed noticeably slower than the surrounding masonry. Curious, she rested the wooden handle of her fireplace brushed gently against the surface. A dull, solid sound echoed across most of the hearth. The lighter stones answered with a softer, hollow note that disappeared almost immediately. She repeated the test twice from different angles, convincing herself the chimney cavity might simply widen behind that portion of the wall. Even so, she penciled another observation into her notebook rather than forcing an inspection. Evelyn's notes still lingered in her thoughts. Take care of the house before you ask it questions. She intended to honor it. Later that evening, while cleaning soot from the firebox, Clara discovered a narrow iron clean-out door concealed behind stacked firewood. It opened easily despite decades of use, revealing little more than old ash and several fragments of broken brick. Yet one brick carried a mason's stamp from a quarry nearly 100 miles away, even though every visible foundation stone around the cabin came from local shoreline granite. Different materials could mean nothing more than an emergency repair years earlier, but she carefully wrapped the stamped brick in cloth instead of discarding it. The cabin deserved patience until evidence earned certainty. Outside, twilight settled quietly across Flathead Lake. Clara walked the shoreline to inspect the dock pilings before darkness, noticing fresh tool marks on two recently replaced cedar planks. The repairs looked no more than a year old, although county maintenance records Mercer had shown her listed no authorized work after Evelyn's death. Someone had invested time in craftsmanship without leaving paperwork behind. Returning toward the porch, she paused beside the woodshed after hearing the faint metallic click of something shifting inside. The sound stopped before she reached the door. She found only neatly stacked split cedar, sharpened kindling, and a rack of hand tools coated with honest age rather than neglect. One splitting maul, however, rested across the rack with its hickory handle freshly oiled, the leather hanging loop still soft and flexible instead of cracked like the others. Beside it sat a small tin of linseed oil whose lid bore no dust at all. Clara closed the shed without touching anything else. Whether the explanation proved ordinary or extraordinary, one fact no longer fit the official story. Someone had been quietly caring for this place long after every record suggested the cabin had been left alone. Clara decided the cabin deserved a proper record before it deserved another repair. Every morning, she worked through a simple routine. She photographed one room, measured one structural feature, compared her notes against Evelyn's journals, and ended the day correcting only what she fully understood. It was slower than replacing damaged boards or patching every visible crack, but preserving history had taught her that haste erased evidence more efficiently than fire ever could. By the fourth day, her careful method began attracting quiet attention. When Clara stopped at the hardware store for matching lime mortar instead of modern cement, the clerk glanced at her order with mild surprise. Few newcomers asked for traditional materials anymore. He scribbled a name on the back of her receipt before handing it across the counter. If you're trying to keep old stone alive instead of covering it up, talk to Ben Holloway. He's retired now, but he still remembers how those lake cabins were built. Clara waited until the following afternoon before driving to the modest farmhouse where Ben lived. The elderly mason answered the door slowly, studying her with cautious blue eyes before looking past her toward the station wagon. When he noticed the folded wool blanket resting on the passenger seat, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Evelyn still kept that?" he asked. Clara quietly explained that it had been Evelyn's gift many years earlier. Ben nodded without smiling and invited her onto the porch rather than inside the house. He answered only the questions she asked. Yes, he had repaired the cabin after a small chimney fire nearly 2 decades earlier. No, he had never rebuilt the entire hearth. Yes, Evelyn had insisted every original stone be returned to its previous position whenever possible. Then he paused for several seconds before adding something Clara had not expected. She cared less about the stones than about what they remembered. Clara assumed he meant the cabin's sentimental value. The answer felt poetic rather than practical, so she wrote it into her notebook under personal observations instead of structural evidence. Before she left, Ben disappeared into his workshop and returned carrying a worn wooden straightedge darkened by decades of use. "Stone tells the truth if you measure it honestly," he said. "Don't trust your eyes alone." Back at the cabin, Clara laid the straightedge across the face of the broad hearth. The pale section of mortar she had already documented remained nearly invisible until she checked the alignment against the surrounding stonework. Then another inconsistency emerged. The replacement stone sat perfectly level from top to bottom, yet the entire repaired section leaned inward by less than half an inch toward the lake. Too little to weaken the chimney. Too precise to dismiss as accident. She wrapped the straight edge carefully inside Evelyn's wool blanket before placing both beside the hearth. The blanket no longer felt like something she carried because she had lost Evelyn. It had become something Evelyn had expected her to carry until the right questions finally appeared. That evening, Clara unfolded the county survey map beside the fireplace, aligned it with her measurements, and realized 3 unrelated clues now pointed toward the same place. The unusual mortar, the inward angle of the repaired stones, and Evelyn's promise that the warmest place kept the longest promises. The measurements refused to leave Clara alone. She checked them again the following morning, laying Ben Holloway's straight edge across the pale section of the hearth while comparing every line against the sketch she had completed the night before. The repaired stones leaned inward by the same subtle fraction each time, not enough to affect the chimney, but enough to suggest deliberate construction. The angle matched neither settlement nor careless workmanship. It pointed toward the lake exactly as the old survey map did. Instead of forcing the masonry apart, Clara studied how the repaired section met the original stone. One capstone near the firebox carried almost no soot along its lower edge, despite years of regular fires. Heat had blackened every neighboring surface except that single block. She brushed away loose ash, slipped a thin restoration spatula into the narrow mortar seam, and discovered that the lighter mortar surrounding the stone remained intentionally shallow. It was not structural. It was a reversible conservation joint, the kind used when future access mattered more than permanent concealment. Working slowly, she lifted the capstone only a fraction of an inch before supporting its weight with wooden wedges to avoid stressing the surrounding masonry. Beneath it rested a narrow cedar case wrapped in waxed canvas instead of metal, protecting its contents from moisture while allowing the stone above to breathe naturally. Clara carried the case to the kitchen table before opening it. Inside lay no single explanation, only a carefully organized archive. Cloth bundles protected handwritten journals. Flat envelopes held survey copies bearing county recording stamps. A leather tube contained rolled shoreline plats. Several dated photographs showed Evelyn standing beside the unfinished hearth during its reconstruction, while another pictured Ben Holloway years younger, carefully positioning the same pale stones Clara had measured. Beneath those records rested an engraved brass compass, whose delicate emblem matched the stitched mark hidden in the corner of Evelyn's wool blanket. Clara unfolded the blanket across the table before placing the compass upon it. For the first time, the blanket no longer felt like comfort carried forward from childhood. It had become part of a system of recognition deliberately preserved across years. As she carefully compared the engraved symbol against one folded survey sheet, another detail stopped her completely. The legal notation identifying the protected shoreline parcel had been crossed through decades earlier by hand. Directly beneath the correction, written in Evelyn's unmistakable script, appeared a single sentence. Restore this only when Clara Bennett is ready to understand why her name belongs here. Clara resisted the temptation to begin with Evelyn's handwritten journals. Years in the county archives had taught her that personal memories made more sense after official records established the framework around them. She started instead with the survey plats spread across the kitchen table, weighting each corner with smooth shoreline stones collected that morning. Every document referred to the same narrow stretch of lakeshore surrounding the cabin, yet each reflected a different moment in its legal history. The oldest survey showed a continuous family boundary extending well beyond the cedar trees. A later county copy carried the same parcel number, but a revised shoreline line, reducing the property by nearly half. The alteration itself was properly recorded. What unsettled Clara was the notation Evelyn had crossed through decades later. Someone had accepted the official correction. Evelyn had challenged it without erasing the original record beneath. The contradiction raised a larger question. If the correction had been lawful, why preserve evidence against it instead of letting history settle? She opened the folder containing certified courthouse copies. Every filing bore authentic recording stamps. Every signature belonged to officials whose names appeared in county directories she already knew from her years as a librarian. Nothing suggested forgery. The disagreement existed inside legitimate history itself. That discovery sent Clara toward the photographs. The earliest images showed the cabin before the chimney reconstruction. The hearthstones appeared darker, uneven, and deeply smoke-stained. Later photographs documented Ben Holloway rebuilding only one section while Evelyn stood nearby, holding a measuring rod instead of construction tools. Clara paused over that detail. She had assumed Ben's remark about the stones remembering things was sentimental. Looking again, she realized Evelyn had measured every removed stone before allowing it back into place. Preservation had never been secondary to the repair. It had been the repair. The pale mortar she had documented over several days no longer represented a careless patch. It marked the only portion intentionally designed to remain distinguishable without attracting casual attention. The clue she had mistaken for evidence of ordinary maintenance had quietly announced itself from the beginning. She reached for the rusted coffee tin recovered from the gutter. Inside, beneath the folded masonry receipt, she now noticed faint pencil numbers she had ignored earlier. They matched the sequence penciled onto the reverse side of one reconstruction photograph. Neither explained itself. Together they suggested that the receipt had never been discarded accidentally. It had been stored where future repairs would eventually uncover it. Clara unfolded Evelyn's wool blanket across her lap before lifting the engraved brass compass from the cedar case again. The stitched emblem hidden in one corner aligned perfectly with the compass rose, but another feature caught her attention. The brass housing carried tiny calibration marks, not for navigation alone, but for measuring bearings across surveyed land. Evelyn had not preserved an heirloom simply because it belonged to someone she loved. She had preserved an instrument still capable of proving something. The blanket changed meaning once more beneath Clara's hands. It was no longer only comfort or remembrance. Wrapped around the compass, it had become quiet protection for the one object most likely to survive years of waiting. She compared the instrument against the shoreline plats and discovered that one bearing line extended directly through the repaired section of the hearth before continuing toward the lake. The alignment seemed impossible until she remembered Ben's straight edge and the subtle inward lean of the rebuilt masonry. The hearth itself had become part of a larger surveying reference fixed inside the cabin. One clue answered another while creating an even larger mystery. Why conceal a survey instrument inside a family home unless the land itself required future proof? Clara turned next to the legal correspondence bundled beneath the maps. Instead of dramatic confessions, she found years of routine letters exchanged among attorneys, surveyors, and county offices. Individual pages meant little on their own. Together, they traced repeated attempts by Evelyn to obtain copies of historical shoreline measurements, tax assessments, and boundary descriptions dating back more than 50 years. The requests stretched across decades with remarkable patience. Some were answered. Others were politely denied. A few included handwritten notes thanking clerks for locating forgotten files stored in basement vaults. Evelyn had pursued documentation, not confrontation. She appeared determined to preserve facts before anyone needed them. That realization transformed another earlier clue. Her note advising Clara to care for the house before asking questions had never been about protecting old stone. It described the entire archive. Understanding required stewardship before discovery. Only then did Clara allow herself to open the first journal. Rather than beginning with family memories, Evelyn had filled its opening pages with dated maintenance entries. Roof inspected. Chimney cleaned. Shoreline measured. Foundation checked after spring thaw. The rhythm resembled a caretaker's log more than a diary. Between practical entries appeared occasional observations written without explanation. Compass verified. Survey line unchanged. Blanket returned to cedar. Chest. Each sentence sounded insignificant until Clara recognized that every object she had already touched formed part of the same repeating pattern. The house, the blanket, the compass, and the hearth had been maintained together for years as though each depended upon the others. Near the back of the journal, she discovered a small photograph tucked between two pages. It showed a much younger Evelyn standing beside Clara's mother on the lakeshore, both smiling into the afternoon sun. Clara had never seen the picture before. On the reverse, a single date was written in careful ink, followed by two signatures. One belonged to Evelyn Harper. The other belonged to Clara's mother. Beneath them appeared a final line that stopped Clara's breathing for several seconds. The photograph had been signed 3 full years after the date Clara had always believed her mother permanently left Flathead Lake. Clara carried the photograph, the journals, and the survey plats back to the county courthouse the following Monday, not because she expected immediate answers, but because every conclusion she reached had to survive independent verification. Evelyn had spent decades preserving evidence instead of arguments. Clara intended to do the same. The courthouse archive occupied a climate-controlled room beneath the recorder's office, where oversized plat books rested beside probate indexes that stretched back more than a century. Margaret Sloane, the senior records archivist, recognized Clara from the years they had exchanged preservation advice, while Clara still worked at the public library. Margaret agreed to retrieve the original Shoreline Survey volumes, provided that every privately held document remained in Clara's possession throughout the review. The chain of custody mattered. If Evelyn had protected these records for decades, they deserved to remain distinguishable from county originals until every comparison had been completed. Together, they worked through survey books, tax ledgers, maintenance permits, and recorders' annotations spanning nearly 60 years. Nothing dramatic appeared in isolation. The pattern emerged only because Clara already knew where to look. The unusual bearing preserved by the engraved compass matched the pre-revision Shoreline Survey exactly. The pale masonry section in the Hearth aligned with that same bearing. The handwritten notation Evelyn crossed through did not dispute the county's authority. It marked the exact point where later copies had begun repeating an earlier drafting assumption without rechecking the original field measurements. Margaret eventually uncovered the oldest field notebook still preserved from the Shoreline Survey crew. Its pages confirmed that the lake boundary had first been measured using temporary cedar stakes placed before spring flooding altered the visible shoreline. Years later, replacement maps had treated the flood line as the permanent legal reference instead of returning to the recorded bearings preserved in the field notes. The revision affected only a narrow strip of land, but it explained why Evelyn had continued requesting historical measurements instead of accusing anyone of misconduct. She had believed an honest surveying mistake had quietly become accepted history through repetition rather than deception. Clara's attention returned to the photograph signed by Evelyn and her mother. The date no longer seemed impossible once Margaret located a courthouse visitor ledger documenting a land records appointment on the very same afternoon. Clara's mother had not secretly returned to reclaim property. She had accompanied Evelyn while reviewing historical files connected to the shoreline correction. That discovery overturned another belief Clara had carried since childhood. She had always imagined her mother leaving the region forever without looking back. Instead, documented evidence showed she had returned years later, choosing privacy rather than disappearance. The realization hurt in an entirely different way. Absence had not erased care. It had hidden its shape. Clara unfolded the wool blanket across the reading table before placing the compass at its center once again. Margaret noticed the stitched emblem immediately. Without prompting, she opened one of the archived survey manuals and pointed to an illustrated survey marker nearly identical to the embroidered design. It was not a family crest. It was an old regional benchmark symbol used by survey crews to identify fixed reference points expected to remain undisturbed for generations. Evelyn had stitched that mark into the blanket deliberately. Clara had carried the symbol for 12 years without recognizing that it represented permanence rather than comfort alone. The blanket completed its transformation in that quiet room. It had begun as a gift easing loneliness, become protection for the compass, and now revealed itself as a reminder that stable reference points mattered precisely because people lost their way. Late that afternoon, Clara and Margaret returned to the cabin with certified copies of the original field notes and recorder's annotations. Ben Holloway met them there after receiving Clara's message. Using the straightedge, the compass, and the preserved survey bearings, the three compared the Hearth alignment against the lakeshore outside. No one removed another stone. No one searched for additional hidden spaces. The evidence no longer required excavation. The Hearth itself functioned as the preserved reference Evelyn had intended future caretakers to verify. It had quietly protected both the archive beneath it and the physical bearing needed to interpret the documents correctly. Ben finally admitted what he had withheld since their first conversation. Evelyn had instructed him never to disguise the repaired section completely. She wanted an observant person to notice it, but only after learning enough to understand why forcing the stones apart would never reveal the whole truth. Clara looked from the Hearth to the lake beyond the porch, then back to the photograph resting beside the compass. She understood the surface mystery now. Evelyn had not hidden records because she distrusted the future. She had hidden them because evidence needed both time and the right caretaker. Yet one decision still remained unresolved. The corrected history, the preserved bearings, and the verified records could restore far more than a line on an old map. They could change the legal and historical future of the cabin itself. Clara folded the blanket carefully around the compass, gathered the certified copies, and stood before the hearth knowing that her next choice would determine whether Evelyn's promise remained a private inheritance or became a public legacy. Clara waited nearly 6 weeks before filing anything beyond the preservation notices required by the county recorder. During that time, every copied survey, certified field notebook, and maintenance journal remained organized exactly as Evelyn had kept them, with Clara adding only dated archival sleeves and conservation notes. Margaret Sloan reviewed each historical comparison independently. Daniel Mercer prepared the legal filings only after the documentary chain matched county records without contradiction. Ben Holloway signed a sworn statement describing the chimney reconstruction exactly as he remembered it, careful to distinguish memory from documented fact. No single paper settled the history. Together, they restored it. The corrected shoreline record eventually returned the cabin's legal history to its original survey bearings, while the trust Evelyn had established years earlier completed its final transfer according to the conditions she had written long before her death. Clara accepted the responsibility quietly. She spent no money on unnecessary renovations. The roof remained cedar. The hearth retained its pale section of distinguishable mortar. The journals stayed in climate-controlled cabinets built into the former pantry, available by appointment to local historians, students, and families researching the lake's past. The cabin became exactly what Evelyn had protected it to become, not a monument to hidden wealth, but a place where careful records could keep memory from disappearing again. On the first autumn weekend after the restoration was formally documented, Clara unfolded the old wool blanket across a reading bench facing the hearth. The stitched survey emblem no longer reminded her of loss, or even of Evelyn alone. It had become what surveyors intended such marks to represent, a fixed point people could trust when every surrounding landmark seemed to change. She placed the engraved compass beside it, not hidden beneath stone this time, but resting in a glass display case with an explanation of its role in preserving the cabin's history. Visitors often paused there longer than anywhere else. Before leaving each evening, Clara followed the same quiet routine. She checked the archive cabinets, banked the fire safely behind the restored Fieldstone hearth, locked the cedar front door, and looked once across Flathead Lake before walking toward the small apartment she now occupied above the cabin's former workshop. Months earlier, she had arrived carrying a blanket because she feared another temporary shelter. Now she carried the same blanket folded over one arm simply because there was finally a place where it belonged before she returned the next morning. The cabin no longer waited for someone to come home. It had become home, and Clara was no longer the woman searching for somewhere to belong. She was the person making certain others would always have a place to return to.